We got a story of an emotional movie. It's called Us Kids. It premiered on Sundance Film Festival in 2020. It's going to come out on May 14th. Director and producer of Us Kids, Kim Snyder, joins us now. Kim also is the Peabody Award-winning winner of the documentary Newtown. So Kim, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. So first, tell us about Us Kids. What is it?
It's a film that is a 3-year journey in the making. It follows, as you said, a film I made called Newtown. And honestly, I happenstantially landed in Florida after having made that film about the community in Newtown that suffered that horrible tragedy. And I really set out to make a film about a nation of traumatized kids. I found myself in Florida by happenstance when the Parkland shooting happened. And I was on the steps of the Capitol filming something else, oddly. And all these kids showed up from Parkland after that shooting. And I continued to follow them for two plus years. So it's really a film that weaves together the birth of, I think, a youth movement that was somewhat unprecedented around gun violence, but morphed into so much more. And also the underpinnings of trauma of kids around the nation. Yeah,
well, now there's studies out showing that 75% say of young people in this country say that mass shootings are a significant source of stress for them. So Kim, those kids from Parkland, they fought back mightily, and you tracked that. And some of the scenes in the movie are so moving. When Samantha throws up on stage, and during the march, and then she sings "Happy Birthday" to one of the kids who died. I mean, it was impossible not to cry. But yet, for all that trauma and all those murdered kids in both Newtown and Parkland, we've basically done absolutely nothing since. So how does anyone have hope, and how do those kids survive? You know, they've been fighting for change this whole time, and we haven't gotten 1% change.
Yeah, I share the tone in your voice in terms of, I mean, when I traveled for years after the Newtown movie, people would say, if nothing was done after 20 first graders were murdered, you know, that was it. That was sort of the shameful moment in American history where we did not do what people did in Australia, in the UK, in lots of places after they suffered similar things. But having said that, I do think that the conversation changed after Newtown and definitely after Parkland. And I think in spending a lot of time with my friends in the youth movement, some of the hope is hyper local. I think some of the hope is in things that did happen on the state level and could happen. We've been in conversations in the last weeks with the community of Boulder, for example, after their recent shooting, with an effort to do something in that state that could be hopefully replicated in some ways. I have hope in that, in the youth movement, sort of looking at hyper local and what they can do in their own schools and their own towns. I have hope in the fact that there were just these kids that we followed, which weren't only the Parkland kids, as you can see in the film, it becomes this very inclusive movement with kids like Alex King in Chicago and Bria Smith in Milwaukee. So I've hoped that it's an inclusive movement that isn't just looking at, you know, kids from mass shooting tragedies, which really only make up 2% of gun deaths. And I think they became role models. I see hundreds and hundreds of kids around the country who sadly are really traumatized, and it's young ones, they're like middle schoolers. But I think that they're becoming more engaged. They're looking at these older kids as role models, and they are making this issue a voting issue, and they're not going away. They're pretty relentless. So I guess that's where I see the hope.
Yeah. So, you know, I got a little bit of hope during Parkland. I look, if I'm being honest, I know that nothing was going to change because I know the actual central problem, which is corruption. The gun violence is only a symptom of the cancer of corruption. But the reason I got hopeful after Parkland was because the kids figured out instantly, right? Because it's actually fairly obvious. Because, for example, 97% of Americans want federal background checks, but we don't have federal background checks. Well, that means we don't really live in a democracy. We live in a completely corrupted form of government. And so, but the kids instantly knew it, and they instantly called out Marco Rubio and all the other politicians. And for a brief moment in mainstream media, for about a minute, we had a conversation about money in politics and corruption. And then, of course, mainstream media sucks. So they immediately went back to protecting politicians. So that's my take on it. And it's also correct. But Kim, if we're being honest about this, is this like you're never going to win on gun violence until you win on corruption first? Because they'll just like, I don't care how many kids are massacred. I already voted no after Newtown. I voted no after Parkland. All I care about is the checks. That's what apparently the entirety of the Republican Party is saying. We got to be honest about that, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that they saw right through it very early on, and I think the other thing that they understood, or they have understood, I think Gen Z in general, that you can't talk about gun violence in a vacuum. You can't talk about it without talking about racial justice. And now the film, it feels more relevant to me a year later, post-COVID, post Black Lives Matter. They put all these things together, and they make those points really well in the film, I think. But I think you're right. I really have nothing to push back on your assessment of that.
Yeah. So Kim, let's talk about why the film's important. Because I'll butcher the Stalin quote, but paraphrasing it, says something along the lines of kill one person, it's a murder. You kill 10,000, it's a statistic. And so we now have endless massacres in America. Though I think 2 people got killed at the OK Corral. Now it doesn't get reported when it's technically a massacre, which is a mass shooting, is 4 dead in a shooting. But those aren't reported anymore. Now we're only reporting 8 or 10 dead, et cetera. But when you see it in those kids' actual lives in a movie, it goes back to becoming real in a sense. So what did you gain out of that, their personal stories? And what do you think the audience can gain from it?
I think you're exactly right in that, especially now coupled with the pandemic, where we can't even begin to take in numbers, 500,000. India, I mean, it's just nobody can do it. But I do have a kind of a question I've been posing to a lot of young people in Zooms and everywhere, which is, with each of these shootings, I think, whereas a lot of the adult population becomes more numb, more inured, I'm not sure that happens with especially high schoolers, because they just seem to get more traumatized and more angry. They really don't have the luxury, and that's what you see through the story of Sam. And I do think that is the power of breaking down these things to learn about very specific young people and how it's affected their lives. But they become, I talked to a young kid on Zoom the other day in Northern California, and he said, no, after the last shooting, I sit in an algebra class and I just daydream, he used the word daydream, about how the shooter's gonna come in, where I'll run, if I'll live through it. I mean, I certainly didn't daydream about those things in algebra class. I daydreamed a lot, but not about that. So I think that's why it's important. Sam's story is so, she was shot 4 times with an AR-15 in her Holocaust studies class. And she says in the film, I don't feel whole if I'm not doing something about the fact that my friend was murdered next to me. So it's a story about avenging the deaths of their friends that they feel can be prevented in the future. It's, just a story about a generation of kids that, as you said in the beginning, just have these enormous anxieties. And I had to go to and remind myself of how many people were killed in Las Vegas and wounded. It's like shocking that we don't even talk about it. 60 people dead and 411 wounded. So it is, we're all in shock that this just keeps going on, and as you said, nothing happens.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, Kim, I want to come back to hope again here in the last minute, because the one thing that actually does give me hope is the younger generation. So my sense of it is, I've seen the polling; they're very progressive, so they're less likely to buy into Republican horse crap about how guns save us. It's absurd, right? But the second thing that I'm encouraged by, and that's why I want to ask you about it, because you spent so much time documenting it and living with these folks and living and breathing these issues. Young people also seem like they know things better than adults. Like adults who grew up on TV and they got taught this totally fake version of reality where politicians are principled and they have real debates and they're not corrupt, etc. Whereas I feel like young people are like, yeah, none of that is true. It's obviously not true. So I'm hoping that when they get in charge, that they don't tolerate this nonsense. What's your take on that?
I think there's so much more savvy than I was about media. There's the kids that you meet in the film are so smart about how they get their information, and how they that I do see hope in that, and I see that they see through things, and they also have the power of social media. And that's really different. They know how to use it, and they really don't care about mainstream media as much. So and they want to run for offices earlier. The best line in the movie that sort of speaks to that is when X Gonzalez says at the end, somebody asks her if the movement's sustainable, and she says, "Oh, we have a lot more years than these guys are going to live. We have lots of time." So, that's the math of it. And as you said, a lot of the polls indicate that this issue, we also hear Lucy McBath at the end of the film say, "I pray that you go to the polls and you make gun violence a top priority." So you see in the film that they did show up in 2018, and the hope is they'll do it again in 22.
All right. Kim Snyder, director and producer of Us Kids. It comes out May 14th. It's very powerful. Please check it out. Kim, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.